Yeah.
All right.
9:30. 9:20.
That's so late. But I mean, at least it's not on campus.
I know. I signed up when everything went online.
Hello. Hi. Would you mind all right. Thank you. All right, Islam in Southeast Asia. So we have the map here suggesting countries where you have predominant Muslims and countries where you have Muslim minorities in different parts of Southeast Asia. And we already talked about the beginnings of Islam in Southeast Asia, where you have by the end of the 13th century, a kingdom of Pasai near Aceh. You also have a few other kingdoms after that. So you have one of the earliest kingdoms in Southeast Asia, you know, Muslim kingdoms. You have Muslim rulers. And then you had also Muslim preachers or tombs in parts of Southeast Asia, including in Java, as evidence of the early process of Islamization. Islamization was slow at first due to the presence of the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms, including Srivijaya and Majapahit and others. But you also had, Buddhist kingdoms and societies, especially in the mainland Southeast Asia. We will talk about that. Buddhist cultures already had taken root in mainland Southeast Asia. So in maritime Southeast Asia, meaning island Southeast Asia, you had just the beginning of the process of Islamization by the 14th or 15th century Common Era. So the decline of the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms in maritime Southeast Asia would stimulate the expansion of Islam through the conversion of the rulers, local rulers, and then the conversion of the subjects as well. The religion of the people usually would come from the religion of the rulers, or the religion of the king would become the religion of the people. So one of the main Islamic kingdoms by the early 15th century, you had Malacca, or this is one of the early Malay kingdoms. In fact, it's known as one of the founders of the one of the early kingdom of the Malay world. The conversion to Islam of the king of Malacca, which was founded in 1400, was an incentive to further Muslim expansion in other parts of the Malay world, especially after the middle of the 15th century. And at that time, Malacca, began to become the commercial center for Southeast Asia. So because it was a commercial center, so many others who would like to make connection, they usually would convert to Islam. So in other words, conversion to Islam was motivated by economic reasons, economic motives. Through this trade network you had more and more kingdoms convert to Islam, including Perak, Kedah, Pahang, Kelantan, Terengganu, where Muslim laws were promulgated, tried to be applied in these particular localities. One of the changes in terms of the transmission of Islam in Southeast Asia is the displacement of the previous scripts, local scripts, especially Malay scripts, with modified Arabic script called Jawi, Jawi, Jawi. So it's a Arabic script, but in local languages. So you have a local languages in Arabic scripts, Malay language, but in Arabic script. You also have other local languages written in Arabic. This is the mixing of Arabic language and script and local languages, right? So Arabic words were incorporated into Malay or into local languages, particularly in regard to certain aspects of beliefs, social practices, and political life. We'll talk more about how Arabic plays a role in the process of Islamization in Southeast Asia. If you see here the map, this is the map of Indonesia and Malaya, the coming of Islam and the first Muslim empires in these maritime islands, right? So you have here the Pasai, the kingdom, the early kingdom that I mentioned earlier, right? And then you have this is Malacca, yeah, the kingdom of Malacca, 1400 to 1511. So that this is the Muslim kingdoms, the early Muslim kingdoms in this part. And then you have this, the size of the kingdom. And then you have this network. Of course, these islands, right? I mentioned earlier around 17,000 islands here. Of course, you had the largest ones, Borneo and others, Sumatra, Java, Celebes, there's big islands there. But you have other thousands smaller islands, including Bali, the island of Bali, where you had predominantly Hindu that we already talked about earlier. All right, so you have this map to give you a sense of geography of Muslim kingdoms, early Muslim kingdoms from the 15th century until around 16th century Common Era. Other evidences for early Islamizations, you can find again Muslim tombs, like in near ancient Buddhist kingdom Majapahit. You also have in these Muslim tombs old Javanese script with that in the old era, in the Saka era. So this is one of the earlier ancient calendar system, along with the Arabic Quran. So Arabic Quran alongside with the Javanese. So Arabic and Javanese in the tomb. You also had Muslim dignitaries and officials at the court of the Buddhist kingdom, Majapahit, at that time. So you already had Muslims, even the Buddhist kingdoms were still at the height, Chinese Muslims also play a role. One of the stories concerns Ma Huan, the assistant to the Chinese Admiral Cheng Ho, who stayed in Java in around 1403. And then he was a Muslim. So he was a Muslim assistant to the Chinese Admiral Cheng Ho, early 15th century. This is just to suggest Chinese Muslim also play a role in, transmitting Islam into Southeast Asia. To what extent the Chinese Muslims play a role, that's debatable, how much or how little, but you do have some historical evidences of the roles the Chinese Muslims play in the Islamization of Southeast Asia. A famous group of people, they are not necessarily related, in terms of like a group, but they play a role in the Islamization, particularly in Java. They are called by later people, scholars, wali sanga or wali songo, the nine saints. The nine saints in Java. So the nine saints play, they basically were preachers, traders, and who came to Southeast Asia and then play in the process of Islamization. One of the nine saints is Malik Ibrahim, or Sunan Malik Ibrahim. He was a trader from Gujarat, although he was of Persian origin. There is not much information about how he really, preached or converted local peoples into Islam, but he is certainly one of the nine saints. And you also have others, including Sunan Kalijaga, Sunan Gunung Jati, Sharif Hidayatullah, and others. Don't worry about names. This is to give you, a basic information about the important figures in the early times of Islam in Southeast Asia. The nine saints, or Wali Sanga, all right? Of course, they, some of these saints would build mosque, would build a mosque or masjid, the place for worship for Muslims, the house of worship. And one of the earliest mosque in Java is in the city of Demak. This is one of the images of the mosque today. Before it was, much simpler, but here, but you can see the shape is retained. So you have a veranda, right? Mosque with a veranda, and you have the symbol of God at the top. And you see here a mixture of local architecture and Islamic, concept of masjid or mosque. So that's one of the examples of localization of Islam in Southeast Asia, which is in the form of architecture, to be specific, in the form of masjid or mosque, the house of worship for Muslims. There are other mosques in Southeast Asia, and then some of them had become national mosque in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Brunei, for example. Maybe we can see here. This is some of the mosques in Southeast Asia. Okay. This is in Malaysia. This is in Singapore. This is in Bangkok, Thailand. And this is in Jakarta, Indonesia. Consider the largest in Southeast Asia. This is Lao Tse Mosque in Chinatown in Jakarta. This is the largest mosque in Brunei. All right. So you see mosque, right? When we talk about Buddhist temples, right? Talk about Borobudur, and then we talk about others like Prambanan, Hindu, and so on. And in Islamic Southeast Asia, you have mosque or masjid. All right. So who transmitted Islam to Southeast Asia? We can talk about different agents of Islamization. Scholars, preachers, teachers, sometimes called the ulama, but there are different terms for this. But scholars, religious scholars, preachers who preach Islam, teachers who teach Islam. And then you also have Sufis or mystics, who emphasize spirituality of Islam, and they usually form or become members or teachers of or masters of particular Sufi groups or mystical groups or tariqah, Muslim Sufi brotherhoods. So you had Sufis playing a major role in making people in Southeast Asia Muslim. You also had traders who happened to be Muslim, or Muslim traders, Muslim merchants, who maybe came to Southeast Asia to just trade, but then they're Muslims, so they married local women, for example, and they, the women, the wives would become Muslim, and maybe also the people around them. If these traders also preach in the mosque, they build a mosque, then probably the local people would also embrace Islam. So Muslim traders also play their roles in making Southeast Asian peoples Muslim. Then you also have rulers, the local rulers, like the king of Malacca, the ruler of Malacca, or the ruler of Pasai, or other rulers, who converted to Islam partly for economic reason, because if you become Muslim, maybe you would be helped in terms of your networks, economic networks with the global Muslim networks in terms of the trade. So these rulers become Muslims, and then because they're Muslims, their subjects would also partly Islamize. So rulers also play a role in the Islamization process. And then you have the roots of transmission from where Islam came to Southeast Asia. You have different theories about this. Gujarat is one of the places of origin of Islam. Malabar, but also Cairo in Egypt, especially 19th century, 18th, 19th century, and of course the city of Mecca as the origin. So Arabs, Indians, Muslims transmitting Islam to Southeast Asia, but also probably, according to some of the historical sources, Chinese Muslims, either through this Arab and Indian networks or coming from China. All right, so the process of making the people Islamic through preaching, teaching, and writing. In other words, they wrote books or articles or sermons, and then they distributed the writings, and that's the way Islam was also transmitted. But particularly since this writing process had taken place when you already had the literacy, that they already wrote and also transmit written text. Yeah, because many of these ulama, Sufis, and traders would transmit Islam orally, like teach and preach them. Maybe they brought with them the Quran, the scripture that we already talked about earlier, and explain the Quran, teach the Quran, and try to to explain the meanings of the Quran to the local people. But writing certainly is also very important, especially after the technology of print technology, I mean. All right, to be specific about Sufi or mystical Islam, Sufi Islam, you had Sufi orders in Southeast Asia. These Sufi orders again play a role in the Islamization, and people would be attracted to Islam through this Sufi teaching. So in other words, Sufism made Islam attractive to them, to the people, partly because Sufism used local language, local ideas, as well as the ideas of Islam. One of the ideas of Islam, which was at that time quite important, is the unity of existence, Wahdatul Wujud, by Ibn Arabi, one of the Sufi masters. Unity of existence basically says that God and the universe are basically one. So everything is one, and all the external manifestations you can find, you can see, you can touch, basically all these manifestations, all these different and diverse manifestations are actually one source, which is God. So God and the creation is basically one. That's why it is called unity of existence. So everything that exists is basically essentially one. You see the differences, you see the diverse manifestations, but all these diversities reflect unity, reflect this one God. This idea of unity of existence of Ibn Arabi could be easily assimilated to Indic and local mystical ideas prevalent in the region. So the notion of, remember, when we talk about Hinduism, talks about Brahman and Atman and non-dualism, that actually everything is one. There is no, real distinction between God and the universe and so on. That's helpful in terms of making Sufi ideas also easily transmitted into Southeast Asia. But you also have the other aspects of local cultures, like spirit beliefs, right? Belief in spirits and spiritualities in indigenous cultures that also saw mystical Sufi ideas, not so strange, not so unfamiliar to them. So it's easier for them to accept Sufi ideas because they already had this conception of spiritualities and supernatural, for example. Then you also have the other concept like sainthood, like the saints. You know, remember the 9 saints, the 9 wali, the wali songo in Java, the 9 transmitters of Islam in Java. The notion of sainthood also was emphasized in the tariqah, in the Sufi teachings and Sufi practice that also help people accept Islam easily. And also the notion of perfect man, or insan kamil in Arabic. So this is a Sufi doctrine of perfect man. So rulers like this, doctrine, like this perfect man, because they wanted to, they aspire to become a perfect man. And by being ruler, they become a perfect man, religious and political, spiritual and worldly. They want to combine both powers so that they become, attracted to peoples, their subjects, the peoples that they rule. Then you also have some pre-Islamic practices like visit to sacred places, the saints, the tombs, the ancestors. So this visit to sacred places also help Sufism, help Sufism's easily accepted in Southeast Asia. To make it short, Sufi ideas and practices and local cultures were not that different, were not so different that the transmission of Islam became gradually and, but surely happening. So you have this process of Islamization and localization at the same time. Another aspect of Islam in Southeast Asia is Sharia. Yeah, Sharia, easily translated Islamic law, Islamic rules. So mysticism and laws about fasting, about prayer, about family, about inheritance, about charity were combined. So mystical ideas and Islamic legal ideas were combined. That's also another aspect of Islam in Southeast Asia. In other words, to be part of a Sufi member doesn't mean that you are against the Islamic law. And also, if you are in the, in the side of Muslims who are concerned what to do, what not to do, what to eat, what not to eat, how to dress, and so on and so forth, like Sharia-oriented peoples, you still also can become, or at least appreciate Sufi teachings at the same time. So mysticism or Sufism and Sharia are not necessarily in contradiction. Another aspect of this is mysticism and local cultures. Mysticism and Javanese cultures and Malay cultures, Cham cultures, and Moro cultures in the southern part of Philippines, and so on and so forth, they are not necessarily in contradiction. Another aspect of Islam in Southeast Asia is education. So you had the centers of Islamic education from the early time to the present day. And in Southeast Asia, you had different names for those centers. I give you here several names. Pesantren is one of the names. Pesantren, P-E-S-A-N-T-R-E-N. Pesantren is from Santri, which means student. So Pesantren is the place for students to stay and learn. It is called a boarding school. So it's a boarding school, traditional boarding school, traditional Islamic boarding school. That's a pesantren. And then you have pondok, it's from Arabic, which means a hub, a place for staying. Again, suggesting that the students would stay, stay in the boarding, and then they learn Islam. The Arabic term for this, or for school, is madrasah. Yeah, madrasa, madrasa. So Islamic school, we call it religious Islamic school. You will find madrasa, the term, everywhere in the world. And in Southeast Asia, this madrasa also is used for referring to certain forms of Islamic education as well. So don't worry about the terms. Those terms mean schools, all right? These schools would comprise of the students, the teachers, and the curriculum, including the Quran, the scripture, and scholarly books in Arabic, mostly. Then they would learn, in a mosque, in masjid. So you have the student, teacher, and then you have the text, the textbooks, including the Quran, and Arabics, interpretation of the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They learn about Islamic law. They learn about Islamic ways of life, through Arabic. So that's a school, yeah, that's an education. Most of these schools teach religious knowledge, meaning the Quran, the scripture, Arabic, the language, again, the one that I already mentioned. But more and more, especially from the early 20th century to the present time, Islamic schools would also teach general knowledge, is what we call, science or sciences. They would also learn math, history, geography, astronomy, chemistry, physics, and others. So in this school, so it's from elementary level all the way to secondary levels, and also to college levels, especially after 1960s, where you have Muslim universities. Yeah. So through this schooling, you have the transmission of Islam in Southeast Asia. I have here old picture of some boys learning the Quran. Yeah, it's during the colonial time. This is in one of the Santrens, one of the Islamic school, traditional Islamic school, where you have students would sit cross-leg, and then they would learn the Quran, and you have a teacher, teaching them how to read the Quran. The other picture gives you a sense of the Islamic boarding school in the modern time. You have this mosque, and you have schoolboys, Muslim santris or students coming out of mosque after praying, and also after learning, and then they will come back to their dorms, yeah, because they stay in the dorms. So you have this mosque, and then you have dorms, or boardings, yeah, because this is boarding schools. All right. So I hope now you have a sense of how Islamic school operates in early time as well as in the present day. All right. Let's talk about one of the unique features of Muslim practice in Southeast Asia. Is through the shadow puppet. So shadow puppet, or Wayang, is one of the means by which Muslims transmitted Islamic teachings to the people, and they incorporated Hindu or Indian ethics as taught in the epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana. Remember the stories of Mahabharata and Ramayana will talk about Hinduism, right? So the Great War of the Mahabharata tales, was incorporated into this shadow puppet play. Just an example, the Pandava king Yudhishthira, the leader of the 5 brothers who defeat their cousins in the Great War of the Mahabharata tales, carries around a sacred amulet called the Kalimasada. So the amulet called the Kalimasada. Yudhishthira, this king, from the Mahabharata stories, this king meets Kalijaga. Kalijaga is a local saint in Java, one of the named Islamic saints that I mentioned earlier, Kalijaga. So Kalijaga, the local saint, he was successful in deciphering, in understanding the magic weapon of Yudhishthira. So he reads it and find it to be the Kalima Shahada, which is the declaration of faith of Islam. So the declaration of faith of Islam, remember, one of the pillars of Islam, proclamation of faith, that I mentioned earlier last Tuesday. So you have the story of Mahabharata, right? And then you have Islamic teaching, proclamation of faith, Shahada, proclamation of faith. There is no God but God. Muhammad is his messenger. So you have this mixing of Islam and Hindu-Buddhist stories, Hindu stories, I mean, Mahabharata, and and then the process of Islamization and localization in Java through this shadow puppet. So the story is both Islamic and Hindu. The message is to convey the Islam to the people. So you have this, right? This again, case of localization and Islamization. Right, during the colonial time, because Southeast Asia was colonized by different European powers, right? The French in Vietnam, the British in Malaya, which would become later on Malaysia and Singapore, and the Dutch colonized the East Indies, which would become Indonesia. So all these, regions were colonized by European powers. During this colonial time, Muslims had to respond, right, to the colonial organization, colonial government, colonial laws, colonial economics, and so on and so forth. So Islam was used by some of the local peoples to resist colonial powers or colonization. But they also adopted colonial organizations, colonial language, colonial systems into their own. So there is a process of adaptation of Muslims, Muslim adaptations of colonial organizations. So Muslim would do a mission using organization as they borrowed from the Dutch and from the British. They would also create organizations based on, colonial organizations, right? So organizations, networks, communities, clubs, Muslims built after they interacted with the colonial powers, the Dutch, the British, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia. They also use printing press, right, in order to transmit Islam. So you see here just an example of periodicals. This is one of the periodicals in Arabic. It's called Pengasuh, the guidance, published in Kelantan, in the state of one of the states of Malaysia. So you had Arabic script, but the language is Malay. So you have Malay language in Arabic script. All right, here. And then you have this another periodical or magazine or periodical in the same place in Kelantan, it's called Kencana. This is in later on in Latin script. So rather than in Arabic, but this is an Islamic. I mean, it's also an Islamic content there. You had also teachers and local rulers here, Muslim teachers and local rulers. This is Tok Kenali, one of the Muslim teachers graduating from Mecca in Arabiyyah, and he came to Kelantan in Malaysia, and then he preached and also introduced this journal, periodical, in order to reform the Malay society. They also read newspapers. So you have Muslim boys here reading newspaper, you know, as a way of being exposed to news and information about Islam, knowledge about Islam as well. Another dimension is politics. Yeah, so politics is very important because it was through Islam that politics of Southeast Asia also was transformed. But politics was again very practical, but you know, doctrinal and and also practical. The term here, don't worry about Arabic terms or local terms, but the basic thing about politics is this. Usually Muslims talk about the house of Islam and the house of the infidels, or the house of war. That's a medieval conception of the world. So the house of Islam, the world of Islam, and the world of the war. But in Southeast Asia, they had to understand that even though they were under colonial powers, you know, the Dutch and the British Christians, they had to figure out whether or not their countries were the house of Islam or the house of war. So they, you know, they had to interpret the medieval concept of Islam into the modern time. Would they consider their country an Islamic country or a non-Islamic country? Because the rulers were Christians, the peoples were Muslims, many of them were Muslims. So that's politics becomes an important aspect of how they also address these political questions. But they also know, you know, learn about certain concepts from Arabic sources like watan, meaning country. So the idea of nation, yeah, the idea of nation was then parallel with the idea of you know, kaum or bangsa. So nation as a foreign concept, European concept, nation, right, as a foreign concept, European concept, but then they use Arabic concept of kaum and then local concept of bangsa as if they are similar. So in other words, foreign terms and local terms were mixed. Yeah. So in other words, nationalism becomes something that many would accept because, you know, because they saw both Islam and modern politics, you know, would require a sense of nation or nationalism. So nationalism and Islam were compatible. That's the for sure. Because to defend one's country, it's like to defend your religion. So you know, it's very interesting combination of religion of Islam and nation or nationhood. Another aspect of this is social ideas, socialist ideas, you know, to communism, because you also have the influence of Russian and Chinese communism or socialism and then also books and writings. So you also have local Islamic socialist movements. So Islam and socialism for these people were compatible, especially for those people, local educated peoples who saw imperialism, European imperialisms as the cause of capitalism. And then they were very critical of European Western capitalism, and socialism provide them with this, idea for challenging that. So socialism against capitalism, and Islam, they located Islam as the religion of the socialists, the religion of the people, against the capitals, again the capitalist power, especially the British and also the Dutch in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia. So politics is part of this. This is quite complex. I just want to give you a sense of Islam within the colonial framework. And there's some resistance, revolution, rebellions against the colonial powers, but you also have adaptation, selective borrowing of local peoples, by local peoples of foreign organizations and political systems. This is a picture of Malay Sultan. So if you read Sultan, basically is a Persian term and also Perso-Arabic term meaning king. So Malay kings or Malay sultans and the British administrators would coexist here. They collaborate in subjecting the Malay peoples. So in many cases, the local rulers and the British administrators collaborated, and the British would be an advisor in the administration, and the sultans would take care of the customary and religious affairs of the people. So they kind of had job descriptions, like collaboration, alliances, in terms of subjecting the people. Sometimes you had resistance, rejection, but sometimes you also have collaboration in Indonesia and Malaysia. In most cases, mostly in Malaysia, because the British and the Malay sultans collaborated in the affairs of administration, the affairs of law that I'll mention after this. So the third aspect of this is law. So you had now the colonial powers introducing Western laws into Southeast Asia, into the subjects. So you have now European system of law, right? Legal system of law, civil court, for example. But then you also had Islamic laws had been around since early time, since the 14th century that we already mentioned earlier. So you have European laws, Islamic laws, but then you also have local cultures, right? All local cultures, the way they did, their wedding, the way they perform certain rituals and so on. So all these laws coexisted or conflicting depending on the context and so on. So you have the combination and also the tension between different systems and cultures of law in Southeast Asia. Colonial laws, Islamic law, and indigenous laws. Three systems of law sometimes clash, sometimes coexisted, sometimes collaborated. It really depends on context. That's when we talk about law in Southeast Asia. Here you have 5 matters that some of Muslims would be concerned about: religion, the worldly affairs, worship, struggle in the path of God, and analogy. But this is just to give you a sense of how people in Southeast Asia under the colonial time differentiate the domains of life into different things. So agama or religion was one of them. Yeah. So agama or religion is just one of them, because you also have other thing, which is the worldly affairs like politics, the economy, business, administration, and so on and so forth. Lastly, but not the least, in terms of Islam under the colonial ruler is education. Remember before I talked about pesantren, right? Pesantren is the Islamic traditional boarding school where you have students, teachers, mosque, and dorms, right? So that's people call traditional schools, pesantren. You also have madrasah, again, schools in Arabic, but madrasah in many cases refers to modern school, modern Islamic school. So the pesantren is traditional Islamic school, madrasah, modern Islamic school. Why it is called modern Islamic school? Because these schools teach both Islamic knowledge and general knowledge like math, history, geography, physics, and so on and so forth. So they combine the curriculum, you know, not only the Quran and Arabic and the Prophet's tradition and so on and so forth, Islamic law and so on, but they also teach the so-called secular knowledge or science or general knowledge, different terms for that. So that's the second type of education under the colonial times, but especially later on. And you also have sekolah or school. This is modern school. They don't teach really religious knowledge. They only focus on general knowledge. If they had to teach Islamic knowledge, they would teach only maybe 2 hours, you know, a week. So only a very small portion of the curriculum would be devoted to teaching Arabic or the Quran for Muslims only. But this school focuses on general knowledge, you know, the secular knowledge that people later on call. All right, so education. In other words, in terms of education, you have the traditional Islamic schools, modern Islamic schools, and modern schools. Yeah, that's how different type of school would emerge from the colonial time and expand to the modern time, especially to the present day. All right, I have about 15 minutes left before we end. This is one of the Arabic school in Malaysia or Malaya, 1934, early 1934. You had this Arabic Islamic school. Yeah, they are locals. They are Malay people, right? They are Malay people. They dress, like like Arabs, but they're local peoples. They teachers, graduated from Mecca, from the city of Mecca. Or some of them also graduate from Al Azhar University in Cairo in Egypt. So they return to the home countries, so to the homeland in Malaya. Then they build school, right? They build school and they preach and teach Islamic knowledge in this Arabic Islamic school, Madrasah Arabiyyah Islamiyyah. And just an example of how they look like in 1930s, teachers and students here. Okay. All right. So far I have talked about the beginnings of Islam in Southeast Asia, the transmitters of Islam in Southeast Asia, the Sufis, right? The mystics, the traders, the preachers, the rulers, right? And I also talk about some aspects of, the methods of Islamization, like schools, legal system, organization, right? Especially under the colonial ruler, the British and the Dutch. In the case of maritime Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and later on Singapore and Brunei. I have to also, before we come into different countries, about Islam in different countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, others also in mainland Southeast Asia, where you have a Buddhist majority countries. I want to mention some aspects of Islam in Southeast Asia. First, syncretic character of Islam in Southeast Asia. Some people don't use the term syncretic, syncretism. Remember, we talk about Buddhism. Some scholars don't like the idea of mixing different things, as syncretism. They like the term hybrid culture or hybridity, right? You can use the term the hybridity of Islam, a hybrid characters of Islam in Southeast Asia, because you have Arabic cultures, Arabic language, the Quran, Arabic teachings, Muslims teachings, and then you have local Malay, Javanese, right, and so on and so forth cultures. So it becomes hybrid cultures. Yeah, it becomes hybrid culture. So that's one point. Hybrid characteristic of Islam in Southeast Asia, because you cannot really see Islam in Southeast Asia exactly like Islam in the Middle East or in Arabic countries, because most of Muslims in Southeast Asia are non-Arabs, okay? So that's why the process of mixing and combining and blending and so on and so forth, adaptation and so on. So that's the first point about Islam in Southeast Asia. The second point that I want to emphasize here is the mystical aspect of Islam, like spiritual aspect, like belief in God and, devotion to the divine, and also the Islamic ruling dimension, like Sharia or fiqh, jurisprudential, legalistic dimension of Islam. Whether or not you can eat pork, for example, that kind of thing, like related to food, related to how you dress, related to how you conduct your economic transaction, family, society. So the spiritual dimension and the legalistic dimension, sometimes in combination, sometimes in conflict in Southeast Asia. So the spiritual aspect and the external aspect, the inner aspect and the outer aspect, the internal aspect and external aspects of Islam are sometimes in conflict, sometimes in coexistence. They don't necessarily conflict with each other. So that's that's point number two: mystical, spiritual, and physical external dimension of Islam. Point three. I don't have the slide. Okay, this is very important. Whether or not Islam was transmitted to Southeast Asia peacefully or forcefully, like using the force. Because in the West, in America, we know Islam has been associated with violence, with terrorism, with sword, with Arabic turbans and so on, right? With Al-Qaeda, for example. So that's association of Islam. But that association of Islam with this violence and terrorism is wrong, is false, it's not based on evidence and facts. So you do have Muslims who are violent and, committed suicide, committed terrorism, and so on and so forth. That's reality. However, when we talk about the mainstream Muslims, the majority Muslim everywhere in the world and also in Southeast Asia, the kind of Islam that was transmitted to Southeast Asia especially is the peaceful one. They use a peaceful means. Remember, we talk about preaching, teaching, and schools, right? writing. Those are peaceful means in order to preach Islam. They don't use sword to preach Islam in Southeast Asia. They don't use force in order to preach Islam into Southeast Asia. You do have local rulers who try to, wage war against other rulers, other local kingdoms, and then try to force them to be Muslim, to convert them to Islam. Yes, you do have some cases of wars, religious wars between this, when they had Hindu kingdoms and Buddhist kingdom in Southeast Asia. You do also have these cases of sword used for, converting some of the people. But the mainstream, the majority cases were peaceful through preaching, through mystics, through schoolings, mosque, and also writing. Yeah, that's point number 3. Point number 4. Arabs from different countries in the Middle East play a very important role in making Southeast Asians Muslim. Maybe they come from Mecca or Medina or Yemen, in Hadramaut, Yemen, but you also had others, Muslims from India, like Gujarat and others. And you also have some Chinese Muslim who transmitted Islam to Southeast Asia. So different origins, different origin of Islam that came to Southeast Asia. That's point number 4. Point number 5. Maybe some of you have heard about the Sunni and the Shiite, right? Sunni, S-U-N-N-I, Sunni, and Shiite, S-H-I-A, different pronunciation, different spellings, but Sunni and the Shiite, they are different, but they are also similar, okay? Sunni and the Shiite. So I'll explain about the differences first and then the similarities, okay? And then what kind of Islam that becomes predominant and also important in Southeast Asia. The Sunni believes, Sunni means the people of the tradition of the Prophet. They believe that they have to follow the tradition of the Prophet and the consensus, al-jama'ah, don't worry about the term. But they believe that after the Prophet died, after Prophet Muhammad passed away, okay, there had to be an election, they had to discuss who would become the leader of the community. So the Sunni believe that it was Abu Bakr, A-B-U-B-A-K-R, Abu Bakr. He was elected by the people to become the leader after Muhammad passed away, after the Prophet Muhammad passed away. So the Sunni believe that. The Shiite believe that it should have been Ali, A-L-I, Muhammad's cousin and Muhammad's son-in-law. It should be Ali bin Abi who becomes the leader. So through the lineage of the Prophet. So the Shiite belief is only to the blood relationship, blood connection to the Prophet, that the religious authority should be transferred. So they had different views about who would succeed Muhammad after he passed away. So this is from the early time where you had this division, the early division of Islam into the Sunni and the Shiite about political leadership, about who would become the leaders after Muhammad passed away. And the Sunni believe that Abu Bakr, and then you have Umar and Uthman and Ali, the caliphs after Muhammad, were the successors of the Prophet. The Shiite believe Ali and his descendants, Hassan, Hussein, and all the way until later time, those were the legitimate rulers, the legitimate leaders, spiritual leaders of the community. So the Shiite believe those imam, they call the names for them, imam, I-M-A-M, the leaders as the legitimate successors of the prophet. The Shia and the Sunni believe no, it should be in the process of the election and so on and so on. While here is blood relationship, genealogy with the prophet. They also believe, the Shiite believe that the imams, the spiritual imams, infallible. They made no mistake. While the Sunni would believe that the elect peoples would not be fallible, infallible. They were fallible. In other words, you can reject them. You can say that they are not your leaders. There are other things. The differences is that, and there are some other aspect of rituals, for example, but not very, very significantly different. So the similarity between the Sunni and the Shiite, the Sunni and the Shiite, both groups believe that, the same God, right? The same Prophet Muhammad, the same scripture, the Quran, and the same principles of faith, belief in God, belief in angels, scriptures that we already talked about earlier, right? And there are other aspects of belief that they also share. So that's just very, a brief explanation about the Sunni and the Shiite when we talk about Muslims in the world. In Southeast Asia, most of the preachers and writers, scholars, traders were the Sunni, the Sunni, because they came from India, Cairo, Egypt, and Arabiyyah, Mecca, Medina. They were mostly Sunni, so that's why the kind of Islam that was predominant in Southeast Asia is Sunni. Those who believe Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali were the rightful caliphs after Muhammad passed away. So you have the Sunni, but you also have the Shiite coming to Southeast Asia, from different origins, including later on from Iran, Iran, predominantly Shiite. So you have also Shiite, and you also have Shiite practices in the Sunni majority practices, like the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet, celebration of the Prophet Muhammad. The celebration of the birthday of the Prophet was partly a Shiite tradition, but was also incorporated into the Sunni practice. But I'll talk more again later on. We'll talk about some aspects of religious ritual in Southeast Asia. Legally speaking, the Shafi'i is the kind of Islam among the Sunni in Southeast Asia, because they come from Egypt, Cairo, and the networks also the Shafi'i. There are 4 major Islamic legal schools of thought: Shafi'i, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Maliki. Don't worry about the names for now, but the one that is predominant in Southeast Asia is Shafi'i. S-H-A-F-I. So you have the Sunni Shafi'i in terms of the legal, aspect, legal school of thought and practice. That's the mainstream kind of Islam that you will find in Southeast Asia. All right, I will talk about this again, continue this, especially Islam as practiced in different countries in Southeast Asia next week. That's it for today. Any question, if you have any, or attendance, please. Okay, I received a few emails from some of you. I will respond later on. And also about the essays, the critical analysis paper, I already posted on Island under assignments for the critical analysis paper. So read that, or I will send you also another copy to your email about the prompt. I will already send a prompt. The paper is due May 7th on Thursday. So if you have any question about your critical paper, critical analysis paper, please, send me an email. Okay. So I'm waiting for your attendance here. Just want to make sure. Okay, everyone is here. All right. Thank you so much again. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you for watching and listening to my lectures. And I'll see you again next week. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Salam.
Salam.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.